Yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining today. I know that that topic that's on the screen is probably a little bit surprising to you. The original topic was future of anesthesia technologies, but frankly, we have a new normal now, and who knows where we're going to be. Certainly, we'll come back to where we are thinking about the future of anesthesia technology, but I felt it was more appropriate to maybe spend some time on ventilation for COVID-19. I have been part of a team that we work together with Stanford University to create a massively, rapidly manufacturable ventilator. And so we've been doing a lot of thinking about this stuff. And I just want to share a few thoughts and a few things. And I think we're also going to have some discussion later. I know that you've learned from Patrick about anesthesia machines, and we can think about how anesthesia machines could be used for COVID-19 patients. So let me see that I can. Here we go. Okay, so I want to talk about anesthesia machines for long-term ICU ventilation, but also surge ventilators. And before that, I want to get into a little bit about why we even need that, right? So here is an excerpt from a white paper that Italian intensivists have published on. This is from basically the Italian Society of Critical Care Medicine equivalent, and they talked about their experiences. This is from March, so it's about, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks old. It seems like 3 months ago. Time is faster these days. And many people think of these COVID-19 patients, the more severely ill patients, as similar to ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome patients. ARDS is when, for reasons of some disease process, your alveoli get filled with liquid, and oxygen transfer from the gas phase into the blood is compromised. However, what they found is that these COVID-19 patients, and take this all with a grain of salt, I'm not an MD, I'm just a PhD, not a real doctor, as my kids always say. So I'm just going to transmit what I've read and what I understand. So what we see in these COVID-19 patients, severe hypoxemia, which means low oxygenation of the arterial blood. Usually as we're sitting here, as long as we're healthy, our pulse oximeter would show probably around 97, 98%. I've seen it. I'm up in Park City, so I'm a little bit, 1,500 feet higher than Salt Lake. So sometimes my levels are a little bit lower here. It's kind of interesting. But these patients often present with levels around 70 to 80, which is really low. If that were to happen in the operating room in normal circumstances, that would be cause for alarm. And when they exacerbate themselves, if they move, things get even worse. And so that's the same picture as we have in ARDS. However, the Italian colleagues have reported that these patients have better lung compliance, which means the lungs are not as stiff as you often find with ARDS patients. And they respond better to recruitment, meaning temporary increases of positive pressure in the lungs to open up the alveoli, to recruit the alveoli before they were maybe collapsed or not available for ventilation, how you open them up. So they respond really well to that. They also only need medium-high PEEP. PEEP, you might remember, is positive and expiratory pressure. So that's the positive pressure at the end of expiration that, again, keeps the lungs open. You don't want to go all the way down to atmospheric pressure because then you may have a repeated collapse and then next inspiration, an opening of the alveoli again, and that can trigger injury, lung injury, and inflammatory processes. Apparently, they also benefit a lot. That doesn't have too much to do with our topic today with ventilators, but they benefit a lot from prone positioning. In other words, you put them on, you put them so that they're lying on their belly, and that also helps with oxygenating and ventilating parts of their lungs that otherwise are not available. They do say these patients require protective ventilation, which means ventilation on the lower side of tidal volumes. And low driving pressures. Usually ARDS patients, you would ventilate them with a little bit higher pressures because the lungs are stiff. In this case, that's not needed. And they're also reported from Italy, and every region is a little bit different. They said that about 10% of the infected patients, and that's probably, if you really look into it, I would believe that it's probably better to say not 1/10 of the infected patients, but probably 1/10 of those patients who have been confirmed to be infected. And that's a little bit different, right? Because we don't get to test everybody. So 1/10, so 10% require ICU treatment and then also assisted ventilation. And ventilation can be invasive or non-invasive. And what that difference is invasive means a endotracheal tube that you put down the airways, and then you hook it up to the ventilator. And non-invasive is typically a mask, a face mask that you put on, sometimes tight-fitting, sometimes just like a mask, like in your home sleep apnea treatment that provides some positive airway pressure. I must say that the tendency right now is to reasonably quickly transition patients to intubation, to invasive ventilation. And that has partially also to do with the concern that non-invasive ventilation often will produce or will result in aerosolized virus particles. And then if you have that, then now you start contaminating your ICU, you're putting your clinical personnel at risk, and so on and so forth. So assisted ventilation, about 10%, and most of the time actually invasive. Again, this is from March. Just yesterday, there was another article. This is an editorial that was posted, and there seems to be some development. Again, this is a rapidly emerging and changing situation. There's some concern now that actually the mortality of ventilated ICU patients, COVID-19 patients, is quite high. 60 to 80% don't make it out of the ICU alive. And there seems to be some indication that it has to do with ventilatory injury or ventilation-induced lung injury. It's long been known that ventilation is not good for your lungs, right? You're putting positive pressure into the lungs. That's how you get the air in, and obviously that's not very natural, right? When you and I are breathing, we create negative pressures in the lungs to pull the air in. And so this positive ventilation is not very healthy for the lungs. When I was working at Draeger back in the days, we had a clinician consultant who suggested to us never to use the word ventilation because he felt ventilation and lung injury was really the same word. So he said, don't even talk about it. Don't call it ventilation, it's something else. Anyway, so there is some concern that COVID-19 patients are particularly vulnerable to ventilation-induced lung injury. And in this editorial here by Gattinoni he's actually in Göttingen now in Germany, but he's originally from Italy, world expert in mechanical ventilation. And he feels that they observe that there's really a time-related disease spectrum that may require different responses as far as ventilation goes. There is this one, what he calls type L. That's more like what the Italian colleagues described: high compliance, low lung weight, low recruitability. And then there's the type H, it's more the classical ARDS picture. And so this is rapidly evolving. And there's also a considerable component here of, this is the time course of this disease, and obviously there's no time tags here. But the idea is that you have some viral response phase from early infection, and then you get into this pulmonary phase. And part of the problem that these patients face sometimes is this inflammatory response, where the body is just trying to heal itself and gets into this inflammation response. And that, of course, can be exacerbated if you do have this very brute force type ventilation, right? And so this is emerging. People are thinking about maybe we should move to non-invasive, but so far, and I just talked to an emergency room doctor at the university. He said they are fairly fairly early on, or fairly liberal in getting these patients intubated early on. And this, of course, was cause of concern, because this is from mid-March, so that's about 4 weeks ago, from a modeling study at Imperial College in London by Ferguson's group. It's very nice read here. And what they've done is they modeled and said, okay, and this was high resolution, high granular modeling, looking at where do people live, how do they commute, and what are the different things, how infections can spread. And then they put into their model the different, what they call non-pharmaceutical interventions, the stuff that we're doing here right now, where we don't meet in a lecture hall, where we don't go to school, where we keep physical distance, and modeled these things and said, okay, well, what does that do to the spread of the disease? And what does that do as far as burdening our healthcare system goes? And this particular plot is from their appendix. This is about the United States, and you can see it here. It's critical care beds occupied per 100,000 of population with COVID-19 patients in the case of different non-pharmaceutical interventions. So and remember, this is mid-March. If you did nothing, then you would need about, I don't know, on average 225 beds per 100,000 population. If you do case isolation, and a different curve results, and if you close your schools and universities, then yet a different curve results. And in their modeling, actually, they assume that all of this stuff would start like, I don't know, 20th of April, and would last for about 3 months. And then all these non-pharmaceutical interventions would be over. And you can see that their model predicts that things actually go up then again. And the scary part with these curves, especially the black one here, is that, so they're predicting we need about 225 beds per 100,000 population. If you look into the US Society of Critical Care Medicine website, they are saying there somewhere that we have about, I think about 27 beds per 100,000 population right now on average in the United States. And about 7 of those are actually neonatal ICU beds. So for adults, we have about 21. And of course, about 65 or so of them, 2/3, are occupied with, normal patients, just because, just like during normal times. And I think that's where this red line comes in here. So that's the line that Ferguson and his colleagues said, okay, well, this is actually what's available. And so you can see how people were really scared to say, hey, what's going on? How do we provide all these beds? And of course, one of the issues with that is, how do we provide all these ventilators? We don't have these ventilators. There's a national strategic stockpile, but there were papers even 3 or 4 years ago where they said, yeah, that's never going to be enough if we have another H1N1 flu epidemic or something. And so people were really concerned. And by the way, I also, I'm going to talk about ventilators in a minute, but we also, when we were talking about ventilators in our bioengineering group at the hospital, we were also concerned about the oxygen supply. And this picture here it's not from our hospital, but this is from a typical hospital. We have these things also. They're just south of the West Terrace, and these are oxygen tanks. And what you need to know is in these oxygen tanks, there's actually liquid oxygen, and that gets vaporized in these gray things here. And then, of course, becomes gas form, and then from there it goes into the hospital, and then to the operating room and intensive care unit. And we talked to our supplier, Proxair, and they said, oh yeah, if you quadruple your demand, we can still meet that. Don't worry about it. We can do that. But of course, the real issue at that point is, as you know from your propane stove maybe, or from your barbecue propane bottle, as you vaporize liquid propane, for example, into gas form, it pulls energy from the environment, heat from the environment. And in this particular case, if you have high humidity, which luckily we don't have here, but if you have if you have high demand of oxygen, if you vaporize a lot, you can see a lot of icing in these vaporizers, and then eventually they stop working. So that is a concern besides the ventilators. but so what were the responses, some of the responses to mitigate that, the ventilator shortage? And I want to go over 3 of them. There were suggestions fairly early on. Well, maybe we can put more than 1 patient on a ventilator. The second one, the FDA issued an emergency use authorization for ventilators. And this had to do with off-label use, so ventilators that were approved or machines that were approved, but not necessarily for ICU ventilation. And among them are anesthesia machines, and I want to talk about that later. And then, of course, this whole topic of rapidly manufacturable ventilators. And so to talk a little bit about the single ventilator and multiple patients, so here is, these are pictures from a protocol that was developed and I think even used at Columbia University in New York, where they were proposing, well, maybe we can take more than 1 patient and connect them to the same ventilator. And you can see this here. You take 2 sets. You have T pieces here, 2 sets of breathing circuits. You have antimicrobial filters to make sure that they don't get contaminated or they don't contaminate each other. And then here on the right side, you can see how this is supposed to be connected to the anesthesia machine, or in this case, to a ventilator. Here is a study. This was actually from 2007, where they tried that out where they had 4 goats and they ventilated them for about 12 hours. And you can see here, so not 2 patients, but actually 4, hook them up to 1 ventilator. This I supposedly stands for inspiration probably, and E for expiration. You hook them up. Again, you have your antimicrobial filters. And then you can ventilate them, and they recorded some oxygen numbers. This is arterial CO2 and arterial oxygen. And as you can see, 2 sheep didn't do so well. They went a little bit higher in their CO2 levels from 40, which is, that's where you want to keep them, to about 60, and then they repositioned them, and then apparently they went back down. The same with the oxygenation, so that after repositioning, they all kind of went up to about 500. And I want to maybe open the microphones and want to hear a little bit from you guys. What do you think? What are some of the issues with this? Does this work from what you've learned in this class so far? What would you be concerned about?
I think the obvious concern for me would be the idea of cross-contamination between patients. If you have them trying to share breathing circuits that are connected somehow, you would get cross-contamination.
Right. Yep, that's true. And what would you be concerned about? What kind of contamination?
I mean, we'll know that they both have COVID-19, but that doesn't mean there aren't other diseases that aren't transferred the same way. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are other diseases that are transferred through respiratory particles.
Yeah, like, who knows, maybe some secondary bacterial infection, right? Something like that. That might be a possibility. Now, they were using antimicrobial filters, so hopefully that would prevent that. But Lars, can you think of, maybe contamination is not quite the right word, maybe more sharing. Can you think of other things that I might share besides germs?
Yeah. I'm trying to think exactly through it, but would they share saliva or anything like that? Because as they breathe out, there's condensation and things like that. Exactly.
Yeah, it could be. Right. I mean, it's short. Yeah, go ahead, Evan.
The air, like if we're not providing enough oxygen and enough volume of moving air, you're not ventilating them properly. And I'm kind of surprised that you can get 4 different ventilators off one machine, who I have to assume that you're pushing the safety factors that were designed into this if it was only designed to support one patient very well. And I can imagine you could squeeze maybe 2 out of there, but 4, you've got to be pushing some of the safety factors from that machine.
Yeah, so I like your thinking. That's air is good. So gases. What other gases are there besides air or oxygen?
CO2, obviously.
Exactly. So so you have these filters on, but they're not going to be preventing your CO2 from being shared, and obviously there's a big yuck factor about this all, but if it's about survival. But how about CO2? Right, so that could be an issue. You could supposedly have CO2 going from one lung to another. Now, how could gas even go from one lung to another? Can you imagine why that could be? If you look at this picture here, this is from a study, and I didn't put the source in, sorry about that, but this is from a study where they tried it out with 4, you can see here, simulated lungs. These are basically breathing bags that they use for lung simulators. So a hint, in this case, the sharing of CO2 would not be an issue. But what is maybe different between these 4 and 4 COVID-19 patients? Any thoughts? Think about lung mechanics.
Different compliances of the lungs?
Yeah. So what if you have a stiffer lung versus a more compliant lung, right? You fill them all up. At the end of the day, they're at the same pressure, right? The stiffer lung will get less of a tidal volume than the more compliant lung. And when you release things, it could very well be that because the one lung is more stiff than the other, that actually gas is moving from the more stiffer lung to the more compliant lung. Now, I have heard, somewhere I read that, probably in one of these papers, that this was successfully done for a few hours in Las Vegas. You guys will remember there was a shooting at that country concert, and all of a sudden they had, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 patients showing up in their emergency room, and they needed ventilation, and so they did this. What's the difference between those patients from the country music shooting and COVID-19 patients?
Their lungs aren't compromised.
Exactly,
in COVID-19
right?
patients, they're
Yeah, exactly. And they may be changing, right? They may get worse, they may get better, and who knows? That's right. And another thought along these same lines is, how would you even know about lung mechanics? How would you even monitor more than one patient? Now you have 2 patients hooked up to that machine, and how would you even know that things have changed, right? Even if you maybe initially you try to match them, if anything changes, you would never know. So I had a few thoughts here that I thought were some of the key challenges. So positive and expiratory pressure would be very difficult to control in this kind of setting. As we discussed, pulmonary mechanics would have to be very similar between patients, otherwise they start, sharing things, and you get different tidal volumes, and you can't even monitor them. And the other thing too is, so what if they're all the same? Do they really all have the same metabolic needs for, do they all really need the same tidal volume, the same respiratory rate? I doubt it. And then ventilator alarms, monitors, as I mentioned, just not there. So that's why also there's a joint statement, I think, with the ASA, that's the American Society of Anesthesiologists, and the American Patient Safety Foundation, APSF. They have actually have a guidance document, and they're saying, yeah, it's been tried in animals and it's been tried on these lung simulators. Don't try it yourself. It's not going to work. They don't recommend that. So I do want to go in, because the nice thing is you guys learned about anesthesia machines, and I do want to go in and talk about some of the challenges that may be present when we think about using anesthesia machines for long-term ventilation. I don't know whether you know, but the hospital has stopped all non-essential procedures. So if you have cancer and you need to get this operated on very quickly or soon within the next couple of weeks, otherwise you're going to deteriorate, they will operate on you. But if it's something that's not so urgent, they will say, you know, look, why don't you come back in half a year? So the hospital has really cut down. I have heard that some of the clinicians, you know, the clinical work has gone down 80% and more. And so the thought is, if we don't have enough ICU beds, maybe we can convert some of our operating rooms into ICUs. And since we have anesthesia machines there, anesthesia machines have ventilators on board, maybe we can use them. And I don't know whether you recall that. This drawing looks a little bit different than the one that Patrick shared with you, but let me just quickly walk you through here. So can you guys see my mouse actually? Yeah, okay, great, thanks.
Yes.
So this is where the patient is connected, right? You have what's called here a common gas outlet. That's where fresh gas flow goes in. So that's the mixture of air and oxygen is just right, or even nitrous oxide if you need. There's also right here is a vaporizer where anesthetic gas gets mixed in. And so that enters the breathing circuit. And then you have what they call a ventilator, and the ventilator pressurizes this box, if you will, and this box is then pressing down on the bellows. This is kind of the old style. There are more modern ways of doing it now. Draeger introduced pistons, for example, and Mackay has a big coil, but that's still kind of a principle. So the box is pressurized from the ventilator for inspiration, pushes down on the bellows. The bellows empty with higher pressure, goes through this PEEP valve and then through a CO2 absorber. And then this is a unidirectional valve so that air only flows in one direction, or gas. The fresh gas is getting mixed into this, and then it gets delivered to the patient. The lungs expand. Then the ventilator lets up, and the bellows are allowed to inflate again, and the patient expires, exhales into through a unidirectional valve, and fills up this bellows. And when the bellows hit the top here, any excess gas gets scavenged out. And there's what they call an APL valve, and that's basically then that determines the pressure at which point this valve opens. So this would be the anesthesia machine, and I know that you've heard about it from Patrick, and I just want to maybe have a little bit of discussion here. If you were to be asked, I was asked by our department, said, hey, Kai, you know, what do we need to put onto a little cheat sheet? What do we need to be concerned about when we use anesthesia machines for long-term ventilation for ICU patients, ICU ventilation essentially? What are some of the thoughts that, or I can probably put that up here. What are some of the thoughts that you guys would have, or some of the concerns, some of the things that we should be paying attention to? What would you advise the hospital?
So this is a question that might go along with that. In the standard ventilators in the ICU, where does the excess gas, so after expiration, is the remainder of the gas just bled out into the room, or does that also go into a vacuum circuit?
Typically, you could run it through an antimicrobial filter, or you put it in a vacuum, but most of the time they don't really have that vacuum there. I think you're in the right direction there. Go on. So
in this case, since we're not using an anesthetic, we don't need to recirculate that air.
That's correct. How would you prevent this from being circulated? So you can see, right? So the circuit here is a circular circuit. How do you prevent things from being recycled?
I guess you could open it at some point.
Oh, okay, that's right. Yep. So you could say, okay, well, you know, I can maybe just take this out, right? I can kind of close this here, close it here, and then take out that whatever that makes it a circular system. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, something like that, so that we push the new air in, and when it comes out, it can just be vented to atmosphere.
Yeah. So in many anesthesia machines, like back in the olden days, I have Lars knows that I have a very old version of an anesthesia machine where everything is accessible, and you can probably do that. You just, put the hoses somewhere else. In the more modern ones, you can't. It's kind of like your car or your computer. It's all one big blob, and you can't change that. But you're on the right path here. There is a way of turning this into a non-circulatory circuit, if you will, and that is by having a very large fresh gas flow here. So the manufacturers, they have all provided guidance documents, and I've seen them. They all come with a big disclaimer: this is off-label use. We don't recommend that, but if you want to use it, this is what you need to pay attention to. And they suggest actually that this fresh gas flow should be about 1.5 times what your minute ventilation is. And remember, minute ventilation is tidal volume times respiratory rate. And when you do that, then you basically fill up, because during expiration, during inspiration, this goes, fresh gas keeps going, and you actually end up filling the bellows larger with fresh gas. Most of the expired gas gets scavenged out. And so on next inspiration, most, if not all, of the gas that you're pushing out of the bellows is actually fresh gas, right? So that's basically one way of preventing this to be kind of a circulatory system. Okay, yeah, good thought. By the way, also, this would be a very large flow, right? So if you do the math, we said earlier about maybe 8 milliliters per kilogram would be a good tidal volume for these patients. If you think about, your average adult, 70 kilograms, that's probably low for an average adult nowadays, but, and then maybe 15 breaths a minute, we're coming up to about 13 liters per minute of a fresh gas flow that you need. And we know that these patients need high oxygen levels. So that's quite a bit of oxygen flow that you're going to be using on any given machine. And that's high because, so during anesthesia, when you have somebody sitting there, an anesthesiologist who really knows this machine in and out, they typically do not run these machines with more than 1 to 2 liters per minute of fresh gas. Okay, what else? Any other concerns, things that you think should be paid attention to?
The anesthesia machines have quite a few safety features built into them. Are any of those a concern when just trying to use oxygen and not an anesthetic or CO2?
Yeah, good thought, Lars. Yes, there is some safety things involved. Lars, think about how an operating room or how an anesthesia machine is used in the operating room versus how a ventilator is used in the ICU. Think about personnel.
Sorry, you kind of cut out.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, you kind of cut out. I didn't hear the question. What were you saying?
Yeah, so Lars, think about how an operating room anesthesia machine is being used versus an ICU ventilator. And think about personnel and maybe workflow.
Well, the first difference in terms of personnel is in the ICU, it's usually not an anesthesiologist who is running the machine. I believe it's usually a respiratory therapist who is controlling the machine. Whereas in the ICU, it's an anesthesiologist.
Right.
In the operating room, it's an anesthesiologist.
Yep, that's right. And if you have now respiratory therapists running that ICU ventilation with an anesthesia machine in the operating room, now all of a sudden they're seeing a machine that's very different from a ventilator. That's one thing, but think about also when you go into the ICU, and I know that you've been there many times, if you look into one of those rooms, and not when we got there just to transfer the patient right after this kidney monitor study, but in these other rooms, what did you see there? Or what did you not see there next to the ventilator? You didn't see a clinician. There was nobody there, right? Where in the operating room, the anesthesiologist or a CRNA or a resident, they're sitting there all the time. So all the safety features of these anesthesia machines are geared towards somebody sitting there. It starts with most anesthesia machines don't have a security lockout. So anybody who could walk into the room can change things accidentally. Many ventilators have that lockout so that you have to have a password or something to change things. And then another concern, of course, is the alarm systems are made, as far as the loudness goes, are made for somebody sitting right next to it. Different story in the ICU, where alarm systems often are coupled to central stations, or they're loud enough for people to hear them. What else is different? Maybe one thing that you probably wouldn't think of it yourself right away. Somebody, I think it was Mark earlier, mentioned anesthetics, and also Lars, you mentioned it. So volatile anesthetics obviously are used in the operating room. They're not used here. So one thing that we would recommend is to actually remove the vaporizers, remove those devices that deliver volatile anesthetics to the patient. And that may not be enough, because there is a condition, it's fairly rare, but it does happen. It's called malignant hyperthermia. And that is, I hesitate to call it an allergic reaction, but it is a strong reaction of patients to inhalational anesthetics. It's a genetic thing. Some of us, very small, I think it's less than 1% of the population, when you expose them to inhalational anesthetics, even at very, very, very super small, ppb level, parts per billion level concentrations, their muscle cells react with a massive increase in their metabolism. And that results, if you don't fix it, that results in temperature going up, CO2 output going up, and they get really, really hot. And if you don't do anything about it, 80% of them actually will die. There is a very easy, you just need to know what to do. There's a drug that you need to give them, and you need to pack them with ice, and then, less than 5% of people die from it, but you got to know it. And that's one of the reasons why they ask you when you have an anesthetic, whether anybody in your family had an anesthetic and any untoward reaction. And that, of course, is a concern here. Even if you remove those anesthetic vaporizers, you may still have, in all these polymer parts and plastic parts in the anesthesia machine, residual anesthetic. And so what you need to do is you flush them. What else do I have on my list here? Yeah, so here's another one, right? So if in a ICU ventilator, if something goes wrong, you have all these sophisticated ventilation modes. If something goes wrong with that, these ICU ventilators, they automatically switch back to mechanically controlled ventilation. If something goes wrong, just at least make sure that the patient gets ventilated. Anesthesia machines, if something goes wrong, these machines just turn off. Well, the machine doesn't turn off, but the ventilation turns off. And they go into what they maybe a little bit euphemistically call a spontaneous or manual mode. In other words, if the patient doesn't breathe on their own, or if you're not there to squeeze the back, because this is ICU ventilation, maybe you're not sitting next to it. If you don't squeeze the back, nobody gets ventilated. So that's a big issue as well. You need to be able to let people know that there is that mode, and you need to let people know that they really need to pay attention to apnea, right? And then in case you do use low fresh gas flow, can we talk a little bit about what happens if you use low fresh gas flow? Let's say you use low fresh gas flow to the tune that you actually do get some recirculation. What does that do? What happens here in the CO2 absorber? Do you guys remember from Patrick's lecture?
So the CO2 absorber should be pulling CO2 out of the expired gas.
That's right. And I'm sure, because I don't even remember it anymore, I'm sure you don't remember the exact equation, Mark, but so CO2 goes in, it's getting pulled out, and what does this thing produce? Do you remember that by any chance? The two things.
Water? Is that one of them?
Water, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So you know, on the right side of the equation is water. And then also it's an exothermic reaction, so it heats things up, right? So in other words, if you have a low fresh gas flow, you are going to increase humidity in your circuit. And remember, these are patients who are already, there's probably some sort of passive humidification thing here. These patients, they already have a lot of liquid in their lungs. There's a lot of humidity going on, and you're running at low fresh gas flows just for the you know, purpose of this discussion. And so you're going to have a buildup of humidity here, especially at low fresh gas flows. And I remember it from back in the days when we did animal experiments over a long, long time, and we ran them on low oxygen and low fresh gas flow levels. Sometimes in these breathing hoses here, there was water sloshing back and forth because, you know, we were running them for like 12, 14 hours. And so occasionally you either need to just unplug them and drain the water out, or some of the ICU circuits actually have a water trap, a little you know, bucket, a little cup that fills up, and then there's some way of draining it. And some anesthesia machines actually have a little water trap at the bottom, you know, at the bottom of that CO2 absorbent here. So you got to really be paying attention to that. If you don't do that, if you have higher fresh gas flows on the order of this 12 liters a minute I mentioned earlier, this stuff is really dry, right? So then you have to be concerned about having the patient be too dry, which is also not good. So those are some of the things. I think even, let's see whether I listed it here. Yeah, so these are, and I'm going to distribute these slides later. Let's see here. What did we go over? CO2 absorber exhaustion. Oh, that's right. So you need to make sure you have an inspiratory CO2 alarm that's set so that you know, because that's the other one. If you run on low fresh gas flow, you're going to exhaust this eventually, and then you need to replace that, something ICU people are not used to because they don't have these. And so you detect that by looking at the inspiratory CO2. And so you need an alarm for that and need to make sure that that's appropriately set. The fresh gas flow in anesthesia machines, if you remember, you independently dial in the liters per minute of air and oxygen and maybe sometimes nitrous oxide. And then you kind of have to have in your head, you have to calculate what that oxygen concentration is for the patient. In the ICU, often you have blenders where you independently dial in, okay, I want a total of liters per minute, this much, and I want this inspiratory oxygen level. And so you don't have that here. ICU personnel needs to kind of think a little bit different about it. And then another important one, it's kind of in here, because if you have low fresh gas flow, because you're recirculating the air, the inspiratory or the oxygen concentration that's going into the circuit is actually not exactly the same. It's often higher than what the patient is seeing, right? The patient is seeing lower oxygen concentration than what you feed into the circuit, just because, you know, they're consuming oxygen, and you need to make sure that you dial it in and keep that in mind. What else? We talked about the manual spontaneous mode. Oh, that's right. So anesthesia machines are made for, you know, a surgery that may last, you know, if it's long, 16 or so hours. They want to be recalibrated. They want to be undergoing a system check at least every 24 hours. Some machines actually, if you haven't tested them for 72 hours, they will just shut down. Not a good idea if you have somebody on that ventilator whose life depends on that, and this thing shuts down after 3 days. Not a good idea. So, but you just got to pay attention to that. Any other questions before we move on to the next topic? Any comments, questions, ideas about using anesthesia machines? Okay. There's actually one question that just came up today. I'm subscribed to there's a Society for Technology in Anesthesia, and we have a mailing list with these are all these anesthesia geeks, and there's a concern now, starting back east now, but also on the West Coast, that some of the anesthesia machines that have been used for longer term on COVID-19 patients, how do we clean them? How do we get them back into service? And yes, they use filters, but can we rely on that? How do we test that it's not contaminated and active virus is not present anymore? And so everybody's kind of scratching their heads right now. Some of the anesthesia machine manufacturers, they recommend to obviously thoroughly clean it, but then also just put the machine for 28 days into quarantine. which maybe you can do when you don't have any non-essential procedures going on. Certainly not in a surge type situation. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about rapidly manufacturable ventilators. I'm sure you've heard all about it. There's a really good overview. I've linked it into the slide, and you can later, when I post this on Canvas, you can see that. And let's see whether I think I have this here. Let me see whether I can show you what I mean. So these folks, they put together a really nice overview. Look at that. So these are 40-odd ventilator projects. Check this out. All these people making ventilators, saying, solving the problem, which is really cool. And I'm part of that one group from, call it the Utah Stanford Ventilator. So we hope to be going public soon too, hopefully before the crisis is over. And so there's, just on this list, there's 40 different projects out there. And I'm sure that you've heard about some of them. Some of them are kind of literally in people's garages. Some others are, as you've sure heard, let me see back here. Here we go. As you've sure heard, there's Tesla is involved, right? GM makes ventilators now. Who else? All sorts of different groups are making ventilators. And I just want to go through a few of those. So one that seems to be very, very common is this: let's take an ambu bag, and I have one here somewhere. Let me see here. I haven't planned on that, but I think I can show you. So here is your ambu bag. That's what you're using in the for transport, maybe in an ambulance, or when you have to carry someone somewhere. You press the bag with your hand, and this is where the mask would go, and then goes onto the patient. And so these people thought, hey, why not make a squeezer? Why not make, and there's all sorts of different ways that you can think about, different ways of squeezing the ambu bag. The ambu bag comes with, I took them off here, but there's a bunch of valves already here. There's some unidirectional valves. There's a reservoir bag. So it's kind of convenient. It's kind of made for that, right? So you have squeezers here. You have a kind of a lever. This was kind of neat. They have some sort of belt that they roll up, and then the thing gets squeezed. This here on top right is something that Virgin Atlantic, that airline company, you'd see a jet engine here in the background. They made that, and there's a neat video where they have this circular thing that comes down and presses down on that ambu bag. Any ideas on whether that's a good idea or not? Any comments?
I feel like that would be really hard to control the positive pressure that you're pushing into the lungs, because you'd have to control how the force that's squeezing on the bag and things like that. So that could be a big problem. Right. So yes, how do you control that, right? Especially on the top right, there's nothing you can, it's just a motor that keeps running. Maybe you use a stepper motor. Yeah, good point, Lars. Any other comments?
With the valves on this, you wouldn't be able to hold an end, or you wouldn't be able to have any PEEP, right? Because as soon as it stops squeezing, then the bag would just fill up. It's not going to hold pressure.
Yeah, that's right. So it depends, right? So sometimes they have kind of a PEEP valve, but you're right. Yeah, if you stop doing that, that's kind of hard. That's right. Yep, good point. Here's some more thoughts. Hard to control. It's hard to synchronize it with the patient. So this is kind of an interesting thought. When we started out on our ventilator idea, we said, hey, this is a emergency ventilator. This is a, better than nothing kind of last resort. So we'll just make it a machine that delivers breath no matter what. But it turns out that if you do that, you can really harm the patients. You need to sedate them much, much more than otherwise you would. Drugs for sedation are running short right now globally. So they're, moving already from using propofol, which they usually would use, to midazolam and other things. And so you got to have, even in these last resort type ventilators, some way of having the patient trigger a breath. And that would be really difficult in these squeeze and ambu bag kind of machines. Just like what you said, Lars, controlling inspiratory and expiratory times, how do you do that? How do you say, okay, well, I have a breath, and the first third should be inspiration, and the last 2/3 should be expiration? How do you balance that? How do you balance, just like what you said, Mark? How do you create the precise pressure control that you would need and the PEEP? There's also a thought about durability. So if you just think about it, for brief transportations, this may be good, right? Maybe for, I don't know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, you can probably do it. But if you run this thing for longer, these things need to be really robust, right? So I just did a back of the envelope calculations. If you run at 12 breaths a minute, you're running about 121,000 breaths per week. That's quite a bit. And these, maybe not these machines, but some of these flimsy valves here, they may be very hard to survive all that long. These are all disposable pieces. They're made for single patient use, disposable. I want to see them run for 120 or maybe for 2 weeks for 250,000 type breath. They also you need to deliver up to 100 liters a minute or more. So you need really robust machines. And then also, you want them robust, but not super heavy. And then finally, and I think that's an important piece as well, you're grabbing from the medical supply chain, which is already burdened, right? You need to have ambu bags. Do we have enough? Who knows? You need to have these unidirectional valves here. You need to have PEEP valves that go here and other valves, adjustable pressure relief valves. Can you really pull them out of the medical supply chain, which is already strained? And that's the problem with our ventilation shortage in the first place. Here's another one. I think this is actually one of them that I feel is one of the more promising one. This is a group. It's amazing. I've been a part of their email chains and listening to some of their phone conferences. I've been on phone conferences on this project with over 90 people. And super good experts. I learned so much, it's unbelievable. And so this is a group that was started out of Princeton University. They involved, this was a guy, where is his name? I forgot his name. I should have put him down here. He has connections to Italy. I think he is from Italy originally. And so, and then he is also involved with physicists. And of course, physicists, as you know, they have all these huge collaborations and they're used to collaborate in large groups. And so they very quickly pulled this huge group together and they're building this ventilator here. And I just want to maybe take the last couple of minutes, walk you through this. We have our air and oxygen coming in from the wall, 3 to 6 bars. I don't really top of my head how to calculate this back, but in our hospital, our wall pressures are around 50 psi. You have flow meters here to dial in what you need. It goes through a proportional valve. So that's your inhalational valve, and that allows you to create those flow waveforms that you need. There's a flow sensor here that allows you to know how much gas you're actually delivering. The gas goes down here to the patient. There's a antimicrobial filter here. There are check valves here, unidirectional valves, make sure that air or gas is really only going in one direction. The patient inhales or gets ventilated, and then on exhalation, gas goes back out. Here's a water trap so that you can collect water, and then there's a simple on-off type exhalation valve. This one is actually a pneumatically controlled. There's a membrane pneumatically controlled exhalation valve, and that valve is controlled by a pneumatic solenoid here. And then here's your PEEP valve, and then it goes out. You can also see here, there's right here at the Y piece on the clean side of that antimicrobial filter, you can see how there's a flow sensor, it's a differential pressure flow sensor. You can measure differential pressure from that flow, and then they ran a line so you also know the absolute pressure in the airway right at that point. And then there's, I don't know why they have a second one here, maybe that's because it's better, more accurate as far as PEEP goes. And then they also have, as you can see, there's some supply pressure sensors to make sure you have supplies. And then up here on the right side, we have an oxygen sensor so that you know that if you dialed in a certain oxygen concentration, you actually know that you can confirm that that's correct. And then this one is a pressure relief valve in case something goes wrong. You make sure that you don't blow up the lungs, you don't cause any barotrauma. And then here's a pressure relief valve just in case this valve here gets stuck in a closed position. The patient wants to take a breath. Right now, maybe it's closed because the machine doesn't think it should give a breath, but the patient wants to take a breath, so then they can actually take a breath and get it from here. They have published this, so this is all available in a preprint type thing. And we see that you can, this is the second update now, I think, and very nice description what they're doing. I know that about 4 or 5 days ago, they applied for an emergency use authorization with the FDA. So that's underway now. They're working on the instructions for use now, and eventually I think we'll see this as a ventilator, as a surge ventilator, which is kind of neat. Any questions about this design?
How compact or how big, I guess, are these devices? Can they make them very portable?
Yeah, I think I've seen a picture somewhere. Should have put that in here. Yeah, so they are. What's a good comparison? You know, the 2 shoe boxes, kind of a thing. So it's not too bad. Part of these valves are outside. You can kind of see that. There is a discussion, of course. Well, do you just make a box, or do you also need to provide a card? Right? How does that work? Many ICU ventilators also have a kind of like a telescopic type of articulated arm to hold the breathing circuit. Make sure you don't pull the tube out. That may have to be added. And there's all sorts of other interesting, right now in our group, we're discussing now, well, how do you do power supply? What if it's international? How do you do all that? So you get into all sorts of interesting details and discussions that if you're just in the lab, you don't think about it or don't think about it twice.
Yeah, because I've been seeing these various spaces being reconfigured, into clinical care units, some of them ICUs, some of them for the overflow patients, but they're just big rooms and they don't come with all the nice, shelves and everything built in.
Yeah, and they don't, if you're looking for a cart to put something on, and Lars knows that because when we do our kidney study, we always look for a cart to put our laptop on, and we just go through the different ORs and have to steal one. It's not like they're standing around somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a very good point. And you also don't want them to be, lying on the bed or anything like that, of course, or worse, sitting on the floor where all sorts of other fluids may accumulate. So yeah, no, very good point. Here's one. It looks a little bit different, but the design is very, very similar. This is kind of our ventilator. We called it Vent for Us. You see the same things. You have a inspiratory expiratory limb. Here's our pressure sensors. There's an antimicrobial filter, exhalation valves, inhalation valve. And then we're discussing right now, we're going to have a simple, 2x16 characters display, or we're going to have a touch screen. We don't know yet. So this is kind of neat. And I can show you, let's see what I can get that video up and running here. I hope the video transmits well. So I'll just show you a little bit on how this looks. So here I'll stop it here. So you can see a test blown here. And then here are those of you who have looked at pressure and flow waveforms of ventilators, you can see these are very realistic waveforms. We have a microcontroller here. This is our exhalation valve. And here is an inhalation valve, and I don't know whether we're going to see a close-up of that. Let's check that out. Yeah, I think we're moving closer, Here we go. Okay, here you can see it. Okay, so one of the goals of our project was, hey, we don't want to burden, to the extent we don't have to, we don't want to burden the medical supply chain. What else is out there? And that's actually, that's been a lot of fun thinking about this. We're working with this group at Stanford, Manu Prakash. He is into frugal innovation. He's from India originally. He's the guy who made that $1 cardboard microscope that they're now producing everywhere and giving to everyone. And so that's where he's coming from. And so we thought a lot about this stuff. And so this valve here, for example, is a pinch valve. So there's a linear actuator, and when you run the voltage up, it actually pinches down on that tube. And this one, the original purpose of this is for adjusting your headlights in your cars. So automotive actuators are, very available, obviously, and we're not burdening the medical supply chain. And the other advantage of that is also that our the tube here that we're pinching, we can actually make that biocompatible. We had other thoughts, and you've seen this also out there. People have been using sprinkler valves. We played around with using this. Interestingly, there's a water inlet valve in laundry machines. But you never know. Do they have lubricants? Do they work in high oxygen environments? Does that really work? Who knows? So this is kind of an interesting one here. Let's see what else is out. Oh yeah, and then here's this is our exhalation valve. Is that right? Oh, that's the one. That's the exhalation valve. I believe that it's the solenoid, and this actually is from a coffee machine. It's from one of those espresso machines. So they also, ubiquitously available, and they work really well. Again, we can use tubing, so that works out really well. You can see the squeezing. See, I should have just let it go on a little bit. So this is another one. Interestingly, so here we have, you can see this a little bit, it goes back and forth. So on the right side here, this RC, this motor here is from a remote control car or boat or whatever. And then this piece here, ignore the plexiglass and the 3D printed thing, but this metal thing here in between, that actually is from a faucet cartridge. Turns out if you take apart your water faucet, there's a little cartridge in there that you can go to Home Depot and buy. And it's they're lubricated ones. I'm learning so much about these things. There's lubricated ones and there's ceramic non-lubricated ones, and that's the one we would be thinking. And so we had to get a high torque RC. And so that seems to be working as well. So we're trying to put together a Lego kit of different ways of doing it. So here it's going back and forth. This was a big discussion. Are we using an uninterruptible power supply, or how are we actually doing that? So we don't know yet. There's a pressure regulator. Yeah, I think that's right. So here you can see here that, by the way, another squeeze valve. That's the coffee machine valve. And I think, and then this is the only one where we feel, okay, well, this is something neat. We can either 3D print it or make it ourselves, or we buy it. We have a supplier now from Taiwan who can actually get them to us. So that's the only one where I feel a little bit bad because we're stressing the medical supply chain. So anyway, just wanted to introduce that a little bit. Here's another one. I'm not going to go into the details. Another design of a machine that is, as you can see, looks a lot like an anesthesia circuit, because it is. And the nice thing with that is you don't need high flows of oxygen if you can deal with the humidity. Well, that really concludes my lecture, unless you guys have more questions, or I can open up for discussion. We talked about why we may need ventilators. Right now, if you look at the models, it looks like, at least here in the West, we seem to be getting away without using them. Hopefully there's no second wave in the fall. But there's other countries that are still, like India, Bangladesh, the African subcontinent. So that's still maybe an area where some of those frugal innovation ventilators may come to pass. We had Manu, our friend from Stanford. He talked to somebody in in Bangladesh, and I don't know whether it was in the country or in that city, they had 175 ICU beds and 2 ventilators. So they could really use some of this stuff. So we talked about the need for it. We talked about anesthesia machines for long-term ICU ventilation, and we talked a little bit about surge ventilators. Yeah, check them out. Check some of these out. There's some really ingenious engineering going on. And then, yeah, that really concludes my talk. And I hope that you guys still have questions or need to discuss things. And open mic. Okay.
So this might seem like sort of a silly question, but why can't we just produce more of the ventilators that we already have on the market?
You know, that's an excellent question. And I had thought of putting another slide in there. There was an interview the other day with my old boss, Stefan Draeger. He's the head of Draeger. And he was asked about exactly this question, right? And he said, well, so at that point, he said the U.S. government had put out a call for people to bid on delivering 100,000 ventilators. And he said that's the global capability of all medical device makers together annually. We cannot, the world cannot make more than 100,000 ventilators. He had an emergency order from the German government for 10,000 ventilators, and he felt it would be taking him probably about a year to make them. And part of that is the manufacturing, part of that is the quality, but also part of that is just the components. Many of our supply chains are really under stress. And he also, by the way, just to get into that topic too, he was asked, well, you know, look, are you going to be responding? You know, are you going to send any of your ventilators that you make to other countries? And he said, yeah, we do. And, you know, how do you justify making ventilators in Germany and sending somewhere else? And he said, well, the reason is our components are sourced from all over the world. If we start being protectionist and if we say, well, we're going to only deliver in Germany, very quickly, the countries who make our components would say, well, yes, if you do that, then we may not be able to deliver any of the components to you anymore. So it's really at least the perceived need at that time, you know, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, was larger, much larger than traditional ventilator makers could produce. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. And okay. I guess on like a follow-up on that would be then, so the reason why we couldn't have just additional, like for example, instead of making cars, we could have companies make ventilators. Is that just because of materials that we're not able to source all of the same materials to make what we already have?
Yeah, I think it's part of that. And in fact, I mean, they're trying right now. So I just learned last week that that Philips has started to, they make a certain ventilator, and they just got a contract for, I think, $450 million to make tens of thousands of ventilators within the next 3 or 4 months. And so did GM. GM got a $660 million order from the U.S. government. So that's, you know, that's $1 billion. And it takes a while to change your manufacturing lines. It takes a while to source this stuff. And so it's this combination of, do you really get the components? If you're from the automotive industry, I think GM is making the Medtronic ventilator. I don't know whether you guys seen that. That's kind of a unique opportunity. Medtronic has opened all the schematics, all the manufacturing specs, everything is available online for anybody to download and manufacture of one of their mainline ventilators, the Puritan Bennett ventilator that they acquired a couple of years ago. So, but it takes a while. And we have in our ventilation project, one of the things is we want to make sure that we have enough pressure sensors and enough things. And it's hard to get them.
With those huge contracts, is there concern that these companies won't be able to deliver because they've never worked in this space?
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see whether they, so one of the things that I already know is the medical device makers, they will not be able to design one very quickly. They just can't, because their quality systems or processes, they're made for super high reliability, and it just takes them a long time. But if they take a trusted and proven design that they make anyway already, not much modification, they can probably do it. But yeah, I want to see whether they can really deliver that. That'd be a very interesting thing to watch. And then, of course, the other question is, maybe we're out of the woods by then. Let's hope.
That's what I was wondering too. Is this going to lead to what arguably is a positive development, that we actually could have enough ventilators on hand for, you know, the events that we know are going to happen again?
Yeah, that's right. So for the next, right, I mean, the next flu epidemic is going to come, right, a pandemic. And then also remember Spanish flu, there was a big second wave in the fall. It started, if you look at the history, it started in March, and then it died down in the summer, and then I think in September, October, it started again. But that's another one that brings up an interesting question. So what if we now have 100,000 ventilators in the US? One of the issues is we don't have enough people to operate them. Right? So we already had a shortage of respiratory therapists to begin with. How do we do this now? You know, if now you have enough ventilators, do you have enough people? Yeah. So that's yet another one. And it looks like there's some training programs underway. I know that our respiratory therapists and intensivists, they're putting together training programs to uptrain maybe non-intensivist doctors or RNs, nurses, to become, you know, to operate ventilators under the supervision of respiratory therapists. So maybe one respiratory therapist can supervise 20. But that's yet another one, right? Completely or largely non-technical. Maybe we, you know, if we make some advanced decision support built in or something, then maybe you can address that. But yeah, that's a very good point. So that's, yeah, Rob, I think that's a very interesting question. One thing that I've also seen in this project, in this collaborative project, and also with Milan, how open everybody is. You know, nobody's talking about lawyers, nobody's talking about IP, it's pleasant. It's really good. You know, let's hope we can keep those lawyers at bay. You know, there's an issue of liability, you know, but still, it's amazing how collaborative all this has become very quickly.
Yeah, yeah, and you think, you know, as you said, even under normal conditions, there's a dramatic undersupply of ventilators in the developing world, and if some of these low-cost, simple designs could be propagated out to those domains, that's you know, hugely beneficial. Yes,
yes, and I mean, we are very, I mean, we're really spoiled with our healthcare systems. I know that it's, you know, it has a lot of shortcomings and all, but I was just chatting with somebody about Kenya, and I looked it up. So Kenya is a country that has 53 million people. That's more than Canada, or that's more than Spain. That's more, you know. Yeah. And the whole country of Kenya has 200 anesthesia providers. That includes CRNAs. This includes anesthesiologists. That's about as many as we have in our department. Yeah. Yeah. You know? And you know, we're really spoiled here. And so then how do you? Can you make a ventilator that would work in that environment? Yeah. So, yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone. It was fun. I hope you enjoyed the class. I hope you enjoyed this one. I will put my Future of Technology lecture from last year or last time on there, just in case you're interested. And then also this one. We'll put that on Canvas.
Fantastic. Thanks
All right.
So much, Kai. It was great.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
Bye, everybody.